You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly, out of the darkness appeared Bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.
If you're interested in what's happening in the world of technology, you will love our Roundtable News Show, This Week in Tech. Hi, this is Leo Laporte. Every Sunday, I bring the best tech journalists together to talk about the week's tech news. This week, the showdown between Anthropic and the Department of Defense. Apple's big week ahead, Samsung's new phone, and a whole lot more. Join me this week and every week for Twit. You'll find it at our website, twit.tv, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War listener question episode. As a reminder, if you want your questions answered, send them in. My policy for Q&A episodes is that I am always down to do one, but I do have to have questions. You can send them in via email at historyofthesecondworldwar@outlook.com, or on Blue Sky, where I am at historyofthesecondworldwar.com, or on Discord, or on Patreon. I think that's about it. We will start off with a trio of questions from listener Nick, all three of which are on completely different topics. The first one is, how do you deal with the sources that overfocus on blaming Hitler or Goering for a particular failure? Especially as with both of them dead, it was very convenient and profitable in the post-war for many of the German generals to shift blame of various decisions onto Hitler. The Western Allies seemed willing to overlook this for the political situation and to get information on fighting the Soviets. End quote. This is a great question, and one that is absolutely influenced by the role that the German generals played in shaping the history of the war in the years immediately following 1945. Just briefly here, after the war, several important members of the German military would write very influential histories of the war, and they would work very closely with NATO at this time, or the countries that would eventually make up NATO, to write these histories. This included Generals Guderian and Manstein, maybe the two most famous, who played a critical role throughout the war, and General Franz Halder, who would be the Army Chief of Staff during the early war years. These histories were supported by the Western governments, particularly in those areas that spoke poorly of the new Soviet enemies. These histories then influenced the history of the war all the way to the modern day. You almost can't read a book about France or Russia, Soviet Union, without talking about Guderian. It is constantly referred back to his accounts, what happened to his units. They're constantly at the forefront of many narratives. One of the key points of many of these writings was that Hitler's decisions, particularly around actions on the Eastern Front, would be one of the prime causes for Germany's wartime disasters. It isn't difficult to call out examples of Hitler's choices having negative consequences for the German military, particularly as he became more and more involved in military decision-making after about the middle of 1941. It is obvious both why the German accounts of the war would try to push blame onto Hitler instead of onto themselves, and why there was also a basis for some of that blame. I don't think they are entirely wrong. Hitler's detachment from the situation at the front would cause him to make bad decisions that would cost German lives in the fighting. Perhaps the most famous of all of his decisions was the decision to prevent the soldiers at Stalingrad from retreating in the face of possible encirclement, or preventing them from trying to break out as soon as the encirclement happened. That's, maybe the best example of one of the decisions that he was making. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers would die because of that decision. But on the flip side, there are examples of Hitler's decisions being the ones that would lead to some of the greatest German victories of the war, including the invasion of France. It's of course possible that he just made some early good decisions and then lost the ability to make more. My opinion is that the Soviet Union was simply not an enemy that was vulnerable to the same type of failures that had allowed the Germans to be so successful against other enemies. The Soviets had space, manpower, and government leaders who were never going to give up. My personal feeling is that the decision that doomed Germany's war was the invasion of the Soviet Union itself, and the military leaders supported that decision just as much as Hitler did. This is something that we will get far deeper into during the Barbarossa episodes, but in my view, once the invasion of the Soviet Union started, and the Red Army was not immediately destroyed completely and utterly, and once the Soviet leaders did not surrender immediately, the war was lost. Any decision after that moment was against the odds, and from a position of vulnerability, and with the odds stacked against him. Hitler made many decisions that made the situation for the German army much worse than it could have been, but most of those were made when there were no actual perfect answers. But that doesn't mean he was always, or even often, picked the best one. One example of this is the decision made in late 1941 and early 1942 that is frequently cited in the works of Halder and Manstein and Guderian of a mistake that Hitler made. And this was something where he made orders that the German forces at the front were not allowed to give ground against the Soviet Union voluntarily at all. There was no voluntary retreats. They had to hold the ground to the last man. This had a lot of negative consequences for the German units involved. It caused a lot of German units to no longer exist because they kept holding the ground. But there wasn't really a good option either way. The German generals, they wanted to retreat, they wanted to quickly give back some of the ground to the Soviets, but they didn't have the fuel or the resources to move their vehicles or their heavy equipment. And that meant that during that retreat, they would have lost most of their tanks, most of their trucks, most of their artillery. They were willing to do that as a trade-off for the men that they would be hopefully saving, but Hitler used a different calculus there. Neither of those decisions, the one that Hitler supported, the one that the German generals supported, was going to end up in a good outcome. They were equally bad outcomes, just in different ways. And so you had the German generals blaming Hitler for it, and Hitler, if he would have been asked, probably would have blamed the German generals for it. It really just becomes a blame game, where they've made mistakes that ran to that moment, to the point where there is no perfect answer, and then they just squabble about who made their worst choices. Goering is a different case, mostly due to the fact that he was far less involved in many specific military choices, especially ones with such wide-ranging implications as what Hitler was doing, even though he was the head of the Luftwaffe. His decisions that had the greatest negative impact on the German war effort were actually much earlier, particularly due to the role that he would play in preparing the German economy and industry for the war. Due to his influence and power, Goering would be put in control of large areas of the German rearmament plan, including the all-important 4-year plan in 1936, which was the economic and industrial plan that Germany would be laboring under when the war started, and then during the early war years. Goering was chosen for this role primarily due to his loyalty to Hitler, and not because of his economic knowledge, which was essentially non-existent. Over the course of the years immediately preceding the war, he would spend most of his time expanding his own powers, including the creation of the Reichswerk. The Reichswerk was a new industrial conglomerate that would control wide swaths of German industry by the start of the war, including much of the captured infrastructure in Austria and Czechoslovakia. In this role, and with this power, he would be ultimately responsible for many of the inadequacies and inefficiencies that the German economy had leading into the war years. In his role as the head of the Luftwaffe, the situation was different. The Luftwaffe entered the war as kind of a well-oiled machine, as shown by the role it would play during the early war campaigns. The tactical and technical mastery of the Luftwaffe in the roles of close support and operational interdiction heavily contributed to the successful campaigns in Poland and France and the early successes in the Soviet Union. However, Goering's tendency towards yes-men and valuing relationships over competency would have disastrous consequences for several arms of the Luftwaffe. This included the intelligence services, which would fail so utterly during the Battle of Britain. He would also just try about anything to maintain his power and control, including the creation of Luftwaffe field divisions in late 1942, as a way of ensuring that he did not lose control of the excess men that were needed to bolster the German infantry forces. Instead of doing the smart thing and sending the men, which numbered in the tens of thousands, to the German army for assignment to infantry divisions, Goering would instead support the creation of a series of Luftwaffe infantry divisions. This was a needless bit of complexity, and they were eventually just absorbed into the army a year later. That's a great example of a really inefficient decision that was driven by Goering and his inability or, unwillingness to give up control. With all of that negative out of the way, it can also be said that Goering, due to his relationship with Hitler, probably secured more resources and funding for the Luftwaffe during the critical years before the war. The Luftwaffe probably would not have been what it was without his influence and his ability to, funnel resources to it. Although I leave that up to the listener on whether or not you feel those resources could have been better spent elsewhere. Next up, the second question from Nick, quote, why do you think that stiff upper lip, the keep calm and carry on of the British in response to aerial bombing is emphasized so much when the Germans and Japanese were bombed much more heavily and didn't crack under the pressure and kept fighting and working until near the very end of the war? I really like this question, and it's one of those topics that can be difficult to talk about. At its very core, both the Germans and the British believed that they were superior to the enemy that they were fighting when it came to their ability to endure aerial bombing. Both Hitler and Churchill, and many other leaders during the war, might use different reasons as the cause for this belief in their own people, but they all believed that their people were unique in their ability to endure and overcome. And they really had to believe those things if they wanted to lead their countries through the war. As part of enduring those conditions, massive amounts of propaganda were used on both sides to try and boost and sustain civilian morale. For the British, it came in the form of the exact slogans that were mentioned in the questions, keep calm and carry on being perhaps the most famous. It was a slogan introduced in 1939 specifically to try and bolster the British people in the war, and that turned into a bit of myth-making, which continues really until the current day. But you're absolutely right that the Germans and the Japanese endured massively greater volumes of aerial bombing than the British ever would, with the Allies dropping orders of magnitude more bombs on German cities than were ever dropped on London during the Blitz. It's interesting to note that at least in the early days of the British bombing of German cities, it was done based on the idea that it would cause the enemy to crack under the pressure, because obviously the enemy civilians were weak and fragile in some way, in a way that the British were not. This would of course not be true. As for the exact answer to your question though, I think that those slogans and that mindset see greater emphasis in histories because of the British being successful in the Battle of Britain. They could claim that their spirit, their determination, led to victory. The Germans and the Japanese could not claim the same. Then there is also just the general power of English language histories of the war, which of course pulled heavily from the British experiences in the early war years, and that so greatly influenced and shaped the history of the Second World War in the years and decades after 1945. Then, the last of the Nick question trilogy, quote, do you use memoirs at all? I've heard that many of the memoirs written after the war are generally unreliable, as many people will misremember things that happened years ago, and that most people will selectively remember what happened to make themselves look good. End quote. I have used memoirs before, but always very carefully. You're absolutely correct that one of the challenges that any memoir written after the war can have, and it's the fact that nobody's memory is perfect. Just trying to remember exactly what happened just a few years before can be very difficult. There are also other challenges to these memoirs, one of which is that everyone's personal viewpoint is very limited. Any individual, even someone like Churchill, who had access to more information than almost anyone, only had a very limited view of the total course of the war. This also makes histories from immediately after the war similarly suspect. It just takes time for sources to be found and analyzed and incorporated into the more widespread knowledge base that historians can pull from in their new writings. The final major challenge is something that Nick mentioned in his question, though, and that is the problem of people being purposefully selective with their memoirs. The joke I often see made about these kinds of memoirs is that if you look at memoirs, you would think that every single person in France was an integral member of the resistance, or that every citizen of London had a near run-in with a bomb during the Blitz, or that the German generals on the Eastern Front literally never made a single mistake. It was astounding. Some of this can be blamed on the person. People have a tendency to give themselves a more crucial role in the story, but also some of it is just driven less by malice than simply misremembering. Memoirs can still be useful though, because they can provide a really good insight into how somebody was feeling around specific events, or that's how I often use them, right? I don't depend on them to figure out what happened. I try and use them to determine the impact that events had on that person. I'm actually a bigger fan of letter collections and diaries from during the war. They can be a bit more raw. They have the same kind of problems as memoirs, but they do a really good job often of capturing those feelings, capturing the experiences of a single person in that exact moment, not sort of filtered through the lens of multiple years of remembering.
I have created the most advanced AI soldier.
The wait is over. Tron Ares now streaming on Disney+.
We are looking for something you've discovered. And some of us will stop at nothing to get it.
Ready? The countdown is complete.
There's no going back.
Our directive is clear.
Hang on!
Tron Ares now streaming on Disney+. Rated PG-13.
Was the Sphinx 10,000 years old?
Were there serial killers in ancient Greece and Rome?
What were the lives of transgender, intersex, and non-binary people like in the ancient world?
We're Jen.
And Jenny.
From Ancient History Fangirl. We tell you true stories and tall tales of the ancient world. Sometimes we do it tipsy. Sometimes we have amazing guests on our show. Historians like Barry Strauss, podcasters like Liv Albert, Mike Duncan, and authors like Joanne Harris and Ben Aronovich.
We take you to the top of Hadrian's Wall to watch the Roman Empire fall at the end of the world.
We walk the catacombs beneath the temple of the feathered serpent under Teotihuacan.
We walk the sacred spirals of the Nazca Lines in search of ancient secrets.
And we explore mythology from ancient cultures around the world.
Come find us at ancienthistoryfangirl.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
The next trilogy of questions comes from listener John, who had some questions that deal with the history of the war as a whole and the role of the United States. First up, simple question, was the outcome inevitable once the United States entered the war? I think the obvious answer for this one is yes, just because of the raw industrial power that was unlocked for the Allied war effort when the United States entered the war. But I'm going to go a different direction with my answer to this question, which is a variant on things I get asked all the time, often from the German side of, was losing inevitable after the United States entered the war? In a war like the Second World War, where both sides very rapidly became ideologically entrenched and unlikely to surrender, which really for the Allies happened in 1940 with the British refusal to surrender after the fall of France, and I don't think the Germans would have ever surrendered. The question becomes in that case, how does one side win the war? I talk about this a little bit in the Battle of Britain episodes, but Britain didn't really have a viable path to victory during the Battle of Britain. It was just trying to survive. But at that moment, Germany did have a viable path to victory by forcing Britain's surrender, which is something I think you could make a convincing case for, was within their power, or at least was something that was possible to do, even if it was going to take a while. But then Germany invades the Soviet Union, and the invasion does not go quite as planned. It does not knock the Soviet Union out of the war, and suddenly Germany's path to victory becomes much more difficult to see or to understand. The nail in the coffin was really the United States, though, because even if you could find a way to make a convincing argument that Germany could somehow defeat the Soviet Union and then Britain after 1942, I struggle to see anything that Germany could have done to knock the United States out of the war, at least militarily. The situation is similar for Japan. After the initial attacks against Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, and other areas in the Pacific, they were completely dependent on the Americans just sort of giving up. Even the Japanese military leaders knew this, that their only path to victory was for the Americans to call it a day at some point. There was just no way for Japan or Germany to directly attack the morale of the American people or their productive capacity, which are the two things that both the Germans and the Japanese were really fighting during the war. They were never going to invade New York or California, and so they had to convince the American government and its people to basically just give up, something that they were never particularly close to doing. But I will also say that the Americans did not win the war by themselves. They were just the last giant problem stacked on top of a growing stack of issues for both Germany and Japan, with the incredible drain on their resources of fighting the Soviet Union and China deserving particular mention for their contributions to victory. Second up, a related question about Japan. Could the Allies have defeated Japan without the US? This is an interesting question, and I think for the purpose of this question, we have to make some assumptions about what's happening. We have to assume that Germany gets taken care of in some way, either with or without the United States. And if we assume that's the case, and that the Soviet Union and Britain are in the shape that they were in during the real 1945, I think they absolutely could have defeated Japan. There's nothing that the Japanese could have done to stop the Red Army in northern China. And once that starts sucking in even more Japanese manpower, British attacks in Southeast Asia are going to be a problem. The question would be, would any of those attacks happen? And I'm not so sure. I think if the Americans, let's say, kind of making things up here, they negotiated their way out of the war with Japan in, let's say, early 1942, it is far more likely that a war in the Pacific, like what happened in history, simply never happens. Instead, the Japanese get to keep some of their new island possessions. They work out something to increase their access to oil in Sumatra and Borneo with the British and the Dutch, and then the fighting in the Pacific just kind of ends. In this very ahistorical timeline, I could see another war kicking off at some point in the following years, as there were many unresolved issues. But it would be maybe the most possible way for the war in the Pacific to end without the United States really fighting Japan in the way that it did in actual history, while also not directly involving the Soviet Union and the British in a war in the Pacific after they finish up with Germany. And the last question is, how much value were shipments to Russia from the Allies? Now, I don't know if John knows this, and he might, but this question just steps directly into a very hotly debated topic of who was the primary reason for Germany's defeat. It is a classic argument that is best held after a few stiff drinks at a bar or in some seedy internet forums. I've been involved in both. To flatly answer the question, those shipments were incredibly valuable, as they provided Russia with supplies and equipment that they used to fight Germany. It was somewhere around 17 million tons of stuff, which is a lot of stuff. The goods sent to the Soviet Union by the British, the Americans, and other nations were a critical part of Soviet military efforts after they began arriving in late 1941. They would not have been in the military position that they were in had those goods not arrived. I don't think they would have been defeated by Germany, but they would probably have issues mounting some of the offensives that they were able to in the last 3 years of the war. But I think they were an accelerant, not the cause of Soviet victory. That is on the backs of Soviet men at the front, Soviet workers in their factories, and the Soviet people doing everything else that was required. For the Americans and the British, it was probably the most efficient way to take those resources and use them against the German war effort. The level of attrition suffered by German forces in the East was what enabled the strategic bombing campaign to continue, pulled German resources away from the Mediterranean, monopolized German war production, reducing the number of submarines in the Battle of the Atlantic, and allowed for the eventual invasion of Western Europe. So I guess to summarize, the shipments were very valuable, but would have been useless without the hard work and sacrifice of the Soviet citizens who used them to fight back against Germany. And they were also a fantastic investment for the Western Allies. They didn't enable the Red Army to continue the fight. They probably would have done that anyway. But it helped to enable them into these massive offensives of the late war years that were so critical to the eventual defeat of Germany. Well, that was a fun list of questions for this month. I already have a couple for March, but there's always space in future episodes, so send them in to historyofthesecondworldwar@outlook.com. Hit me up on Blue Sky, Discord, or however else you may be able to send me a message.